Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Intermountain West monthly webinar with the National Integrated Drought Information System, or NIDIS. My name is Gretel Fallingstad, and I am the Intermountain West Drought Early Warning System Regional Coordinator, as well as our Drought Risk and Resilience Planning Platform Lead. These Intermountain West monthly webinars are briefings that are in partnerships with all of the 5 states in the region, which includes Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. We aim to provide the most up-to-date drought and climate information and connect climate service providers with resource managers and resource managers with one another, with the goal of increasing landscape and community resilience in current and future drought. The IMW DOE's regional partners include other federal and state agencies, which provide key information on special topics as well as climatology, including the National Drought Mitigation Center and the USDA Climate Hubs, the USGS, among others. I want to take a moment today to review the drought conditions currently across the Intermountain West. Arizona has 25.3% of the state in drought, Colorado 9% in drought, New Mexico at 74.2% drought, Utah 0.2% drought, and Wyoming is at 20% drought. John Mayer is going to give us the overview of these conditions. John is one of our guest speakers today. We welcome John. He is the Assistant State Climatologist at the Utah Climate Center. He specializes in research to operations to address Utah's climate services, as well as operational numerical weather and climate modeling. John has enjoyed pursuing topics focused on understanding Western U.S. hydroclimate and precipitation changes in both the winter snowpack and summer monsoon seasons. In addition to his research to operations work, Dr. Mayer also serves on the Utah Drought Task Force and is the state coordinator for the CocoRoss network. We also are very happy to have Curtis Rigonti, who is with the National Drought Mitigation Center today, and he's going to share about the Drought Risk Atlas tool. Curtis is a climatologist at the National Drought Mitigation Center and one of the U.S. Drought Monitor authors. Aside from this, he also does work looking at long-term trends in drought in the United States. I wanted to draw your attention to NIDIS's snow drought update from May 2024. You're able to link into that update with this QR code to get the latest snow drought conditions. And as you can see from this map, which is a little updated from the actual snow drought update, this one is from today. And as you can see, New Mexico and Southwest Colorado are both starting to see that spring runoff and lower snow levels across the state, which will affect runoff and water supply. And so without further ado, I will pass this along to John to give us our drought update. John, I'm going to make you presenter and then I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Gretel. Okay, I presume my full screen presentation is visible. If not, go ahead and give me a holler. Appreciate the opportunity. You all good, Gretel?
Yeah, looks great.
Great. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to again update the group on conditions of drought throughout the Intermountain West, as well as give a brief outlook on expectations for what may be in store for the upcoming season as we transition from late spring to early summer. Kind of a redundant recap here, but of course, seeing things twice is always helpful. But we have the current map of conditions across the region, and I won't get into the weeds of the numbers and percentages of the table. Gretel has already given a nice overview of the breakdown of droughts. I think the general takeaway from current conditions right now is that a great deal of the Intermountain West is either drought-free or abnormally dry, which is the weakest category of drought impacts across our D0 through D4 categories. Only 5% of the region is D2 or above. And so for a region that has had pretty impactful drought over the last half decade, to be exiting the snow season and into the warm season with this type of perspective is a source of optimism, I think, for a great deal of folks in the entire region. Changes over the last month are shown here in the figure on the left. This is a 4-week class change that indicates areas that have experienced degradation or improvements. And the take-home message from this is that the majority of the region has sort of held steady over the last month. A little bit of noise throughout the Intermountain West in terms of changes, but overall not a great deal of pressure or relief being applied at this time of the year. Areas in green indicate improvements, and we can see where those are found generally is just a single one-class improvement for conditions. We do have a few pockets in eastern Wyoming and Colorado where we've had some degradation, introducing one and a few areas, 2-class degradations of drought conditions. And as we'll see throughout the presentation, these areas and a few other pockets throughout the Intermountain West are places where our drought eyes are heavily focused on as we transition into the season. That tends to exacerbate drought conditions as we warm up and dry out from our spring season. I also like to look at the water year class change. The figure on the right shows how things have trended since the beginning of the water year. For those that aren't familiar with the water year, that begins October 1st. And as we've seen over the last almost half year now, most of the region in the southern portions of the Intermountain West and the Four Corners area have experienced improvements. That's a function of the nice snowpack that we've had transitioning through the fall and into the winter. However, the Wyoming and Colorado areas are places that have experienced increasing drought pressures and impacts with 1 to 2, and in a small pocket in eastern Colorado, a 3-class degradation since the beginning of the water year. So again, these are areas that our drought eyes are focused on, monitoring conditions as we transition seasons. Gretel has already sort of primed our brains for conditions of snowpack. I'll step back a little bit farther in time than Gretel's May 20th figure here. The figure on the left shows our April 1st snowpack relative to the median. April 1st is a very rough time of the year where snow surveys are done and conducted, and we're getting an idea of the amount of water content in our snowpack, and so that's why I've chosen to step back to give a little bit of an overview from right around the time of year when we expect to have peak snowpack. And you can see those blues and greens really dominate the region, and with the exception of northeastern Wyoming, the Intermountain West as a whole experienced above normal snowpack, according to at least April 1st. We've seen in Gretel's May 20th figure here how things have held on and kept pace throughout the season, or maybe have not in some areas in farther warmer southern latitudes. But overall, we'll look back and we'll feel pretty good about our snowpack for this year. It wasn't as good as 2 years ago, but anything above normal is a positive and does beneficial things for drought relief. One of the things that we keep an eye on this time of year is soil moisture as we exit the runoff season, the snowmelt season. And this gives us a pretty good idea on water resources that is usable going forward and how that can impact the seasonal transition. The figure on the right shows current soil moisture according to NRCS's SNOTEL and SCAN networks. These are primarily high elevation stations, although the scan network starts to come down into the lower elevations. But collectively across the Intermountain West, soil moisture, it is a very positive place, again, reflecting the positive snowpack, contributing to the higher soil moisture. So both good signs going forward. I would say the only warning flag is those two basins in central and eastern Colorado as you get into the Front Range and out over the slopes of the Rockies there. Those two basins with the orange colors, the only spots currently that are sitting below normal to a significant degree for soil moisture. Again, in sort of that bullseye that we'll be keeping an eye on both in today's presentation and going forward for us drought watchers. Recent conditions of temperature and precipitation as we transition seasons is an important aspect of setting the stage for our expectations into the growing season. Over the last 30 days, the figure on the left shows the departure from normal temperatures, maximum temperature in this case, and collectively across the Intermountain West and a great portion of the western United States, the last 30 days were pretty normal. Most areas are in that white color shading, which is indicating right around normal. Areas that do deviate on one side or the other are not deviating tremendously so, and we would expect some areas are going to be a little bit above, other areas a little bit below normal. But generally speaking, over the last 30 days, this has been a pretty normal late April and beginning of May conditions for the region. From a precipitation perspective, the 30-day percent of normal precipitation is shown on the right. Areas of brown are regions that have experienced lower than normal precipitation. Areas of green have experienced above normal precipitation. And this one's a little bit more dramatic than the temperature map. And we see areas specifically in southern Arizona and New Mexico, as well as portions of western Utah, the Four Corners area, a little bit of eastern Wyoming and Colorado have all seen less than normal precipitation. And certainly the feature here is going to be the Arizona, New Mexico regions, which have experienced little to no precipitation over the last 30 days. Not terribly unheard of for this time of year down there. They're going to make a lot of their precipitation bank here this summer with the monsoon season. But this certainly will stress the soil moisture that they do have in place, as well as not really bumping up our savings account going into the season where we really stress the landscape's water resources. Other than that, not a tremendous deviation from normal for much of the Intermountain West, but you can see a bit of the mixed signal depending on where you are most interested in. Could go one way or the other. Evaporative demand is a metric that we here, at least in Utah, and I'm guessing many other drought managers and watchers are keeping a close eye out on this time of year as we exit the spring runoff with great amount of soil moisture in place. Watching how that soil moisture is stressed and moved about the topsoil is a good indicator of how things will trend as we enter into the warm season. Over the last 4 weeks, the Evaporative Demand Drought Index, or EDDI, is shown on the left here. And this is capturing as many of the atmospheric and land surface properties as possible to estimate the amount of stress being placed on the water at the surface. So we're talking about both atmospheric evaporation and evapotranspiration from plants and from the soil. And areas of blue indicate a little bit better than normal for this time of year, meaning less stress on the land surface. Areas of yellow, we don't have anything above that, are indicating areas that are seeing a little bit higher than normal stress this time of year. Another metric looking at evaporation is the ESI, or Evaporative Stress Index, shown on the right. And this is, again, a little bit similar window of time, looking at short-term conditions and impacts from weather conditions, as well as evaporation, evapotranspiration on the surface. And this tells a little bit different story in terms of areas that are experiencing above normal evapotranspiration. And those areas in eastern Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico that we've had our eyes on already in this presentation, are denoting a little bit of abnormal stress for this time of year. The land surface is available water. So a little bit of mixed signal depending on which metric you look at and the time scales. You'll note there's a 1 week difference between the eddy on the left, which is valid on May 13th, a week old, and the evaporative stress index on the right, which is valid to the 20th, yesterday. So the last week has certainly trended us towards warmer and drier conditions, and my guess is that's really showing up in the signal here in those areas, and why we have some differences in opinions, but depending on which metric we look at. Seeing elevated evaporative stress this time of year is certainly drawing out a little bit more from our savings account than we'd like to see this time of year, where we prefer to be holding on to as much of that as possible. But again, we have elevated soil moisture, and so we do have a little bit of a buffer to withstand this before impacts are really felt from the evaporation. A few other drought metrics that I like to look at this time of year is the quick dry. The quick drought response index is a short-term high frequency drought metric, and this is looking at conditions over the last couple of weeks and how they are applying pressure on the landscape, trying to capture short-term trends in drought impacts and stresses. And we can see again, as will be the theme for several of our slides going forward, is areas east of the Rockies have experienced the greatest short-term drought pressure, although according to Quick Dry, we have quite a few areas in the Intermountain West that are starting to transition away from this cooler and wetter spring pattern and a little bit more into the warmer, drier summer pattern. I do note that the Quick Dry map here is again 1 week outdated, so we have not included the last week of weather conditions in this. And at least for Utah and our neighboring states, the last week has been fairly hot and dry. And so I would expect this signal to continue to play out with the next update of Quick Dry. Figure on the right shows the vegetation drought response index, and this is looking at the landscape's vegetation, whether that be natural or man-made, and looking at growing conditions and the deviations from normal for that. And this is, again, probably the most solid indicator of the ongoing presence of sort of this long-term hydrologic drought, where we've had a couple of good years of snow, decent monsoons over the last couple of years. However, the long-term hydrologic drought is continuing to stress the vegetative landscape, whether that be farmland and rangeland or natural forests and dry land. So a lot of the Four Corners area, eastern Utah, western Utah, northern Arizona, and northwestern New Mexico are experiencing the greatest vegetation impacts from drought. But we do see impacts popping up into the farmlands in eastern Colorado as well. Right in that bullseye where we're kind of keeping an eye on. Some really nice metrics combining lots of different things across the drought world into a single index. We have the short-term and the long-term multi-indicator drought index, or MIDIs. And short-term is on the left, and long-term is on the right. And the general takeaway from these two is that we still have ongoing long-term drought pressure being placed in several of the Intermountain West states. Four Corners area has been an area that we've been watching for the last year. However, New Mexico is really starting to pop up in some of those deeper red, impactful colors over the long-term drought indices. Short-term, a little bit better story in terms of impacts, although the general spatial pattern is eerily similar between the short-term and the long-terms. And so that phase alignment of impacts on both short-term and long-term is some cause for caution and an area that we'll be monitoring going forward for drought degradation in parts of the Intermountain West, mostly the southern portions of those states in the Intermountain West. All right, so we'll move forward and look at some of the drought outlooks. I won't spend too much time talking about this because we're entering in probably the least predictable season of the year, which is the summer monsoon. This is obviously a significant weather pattern for this time of year as we enter into the summer, and it's a key component of shaping drought trends throughout the Intermountain West and the Western U.S. in general. So this is the time of year when we're really trying to get a handle on exactly what the monsoon season will look like, and if we're expecting above or below average conditions in the region. A couple of mechanisms to consider when we look at the monsoon is, first of all, the high regional soil moisture that is present tends to delay the monsoon onset. This is a physical mechanism associated with the radiation budget as we transition into the summer season. And high soil moisture leads to a slower onset of the monsoon circulation pattern and tends to delay the arrival of the summer rainfall to much of the U.S.'s monsoon territory. Played out the same way last year, and my bet is that that continues to be a physical mechanism shaping at least the seasonal onset this year. Another key component that we're keeping an eye on is the ENSO cycle. The expectation is we will be transitioning from neutral conditions at the moment to La Nina conditions. The figure that I've set in here on the right shows the probabilities of La Nina, neutral, or El Nino conditions in the Pacific. And we can see on the x-axis is the 3-month seasonal acronym, so beginning April, May, June, and then May, June, July, August, and so on and so forth. We can see those bars with blue coloring begin to take form about the June, July, August, September period. And so the expectation is late summer, La Nina will begin to develop in the Pacific. 3 or 4 months ago, the expectation that was going to be a little bit earlier, and that tends to push the summer monsoon towards above average precipitation. I've included it here because as the onset of La Nina has delayed a little bit, we're no longer expecting as much of a push on the monsoon season from this ENSO transition in the Pacific. So that probably makes things a little bit harder to predict. The Madden-Julian oscillation is another thing that we look at. This is a tropical fluctuation in weather patterns that rotates around the globe. And if it's in the right phase, in the right spot in the hemisphere, it can impact lots of things with the monsoon seasonality. And a couple of weeks ago, the expectation was it was going to be in phase to cause an early Eastern Pacific tropical cyclone season. And that would potentially ramp up the monsoon outlook. The MJO has weakened since, and the expectations are for less impact. So now we have lost out on 2 of our teleconnections that give us some measure of predictability for the monsoon season, making it that much more unpredictable. So right now, at least in my mind, somebody that's been looking at the monsoon for a while, is that the only thing I feel very confident about is that a delayed onset for at least the northern periphery of the U.S.'s monsoon season. Who knows what will happen down in the border with Arizona and New Mexico and Mexico. Hopefully they start things off early. All right, the last slide here is climate outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center. Expectation for June, July, August is once again for, I think, the 22nd of 24 summers since the turn of the century, is for yet another hotter than normal summer outlook for the Western U.S. And you can see on the left of this figure, those deepest reds indicating their highest degree of confidence for this seasonal pattern falls right in that Four Corners area in the Intermountain West. So they are pretty confident based on current outlooks that the region will be warmer than average, which is disheartening for folks that are not warm season people. Precipitation, this has changed a little bit since the last update. What was before a less bearish precipitation outlook for the region has turned more bearish, meaning that we have an expanded area of those below normal probabilities throughout the region. All but southwestern and western Arizona are falling into that below average probabilities. They were a little bit less impactful the last update, so this seems to indicate that they feel more strongly about the presence of below average precipitation in those areas of brown there for the June, July, August period. So it seems to be that the Intermountain West is due for a hot, potentially dry summer monsoon season that might get started a little bit later than normal. So water resources, irrigation, evaporative demand, all those things may end up being greater than normal and further stress conditions going forward. But keep in mind, the monsoon is an incredibly challenging weather pattern to predict at any time scale. Even daily timescales, weather models struggle with capturing the monsoon pattern. So seasonal prediction, the skill there is pretty low for this time of year, and things can change very quickly with just a couple of events like a landfalling Eastern Pacific cyclone. Then lastly here, the drought outlook from the CPC reflects a lot of the things that we've mentioned here in the last couple of minutes. Areas that have the yellow colors are drought development likely. So take what you have now and exacerbate it just a little bit. Areas of brown are drought persisting, meaning they're not expecting things to change greatly. But a large swath of the Intermountain West is in areas that are expected to experience either persisting drought or drought development and amplification possible. Also, northern Wyoming is an area where drought impacts are expected to remain present. So a fair amount of the Intermountain West will be under the drought concern for the summer, and we'll be certainly keeping an eye out as conditions transition out of the spring weather pattern and we start to get stuck in the high pressures. Quick summary if you would like to read, but overall, most of the region is pretty good right now. The winter snowpack and soil moisture are in great places. Reservoirs across the region are pretty good compared to where we've been over the last couple of years, although there are signals of ongoing long-term drought. Increased evaporative demand and the recent warm and dry conditions is going to start to place some elevated drought pressures, specifically in areas east of the Rockies and around the Four Corners region. And we are looking at expanding drought conditions over the next couple of months in many areas of the Intermountain West. So, we have contact info for all the climate centers and people that are involved with drought monitoring and drought assessment. Feel free to reach out to your neighborhood drought weather weenie with any questions. I'm also happy to field questions at the end of this or over email afterwards. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, John. Another amazing presentation, chock full of very valuable information. And next, we will transition to Curtis. And Curtis is going to give us an overview about the Drought Risk Atlas and walk us through how to use the Drought Risk Atlas. And so, Curtis, you should be able to share your screen at this point.
Right, I think I am already, so let me know if you can't see it.
Looks good. You are
Okay.
not in mode just yet, but I see you getting there.
All right, I'll go ahead and get us started here. So first, thank you for having me. And John, that was a great presentation, really good overview of a lot of the current drought conditions, or really, for the most part, thankfully, lack thereof across the Intermountain West. So the tool I'm going to go into today is, some of you may already be familiar with this, but this is our Drought Risk Atlas at the National Drought Mitigation Center. And so this really is looking at a lot of the historical data that some of the drought indices that John was referring to have their data based off of. Can everyone see my normal slides here, or do you see this in presenter view right now?
We still see presenter view instead of slideshow view.
Okay, I'm going to see if I can figure out how to change that. Swap. Okay, I think we're good now.
No, that's good.
Okay, thank you. All right, so most of this presentation really is going to be just a walk around the actual website itself. So if you want to go ahead and, if anyone wants to kind of do this with me, I'll just show you around the website. But So it's a drought risk atlas. So you can go to droughtatlas.unl.edu. And so what this is it's a collection of weather stations collecting long-term climate data and hydrology stations collecting stream flow data across the United States. And so we've built historical drought indices from this, such as your SPI, or Standardized Precipitation Index, or your SPEI, Standardized Precipitation Evapotranspiration Index, as well as a standardized stream flow index from the stream flow data. And we've made this data available at each of the stations for which these types of data are available. We've done some other statistics with this, such as grouping different stations that are in similar climates that tend to behave similarly, a little bit like some of the climate divisions, but a little bit finer scale. Some of the methodology from that was fine-tuned a little bit by a mathematician we had working with us for a little while, several years ago. So I'm just going to show you guys some of those tools. Additionally, I've been working on long-term trends in different drought indices in the United States. So as John alluded to, like 22 of the last 24 summers have had outlooks for warmer than normal conditions across the Western United States. That obviously is indicative of some of the long-term climate change that we've had, especially in that region. So we'll take a look at what some of the drought data tends to say about that. Pardon me, I'm going to take a sip of water. All right, so I'm going to actually exit the presentation view and pull up Google Chrome here. I accidentally muted myself. I want to, can we still see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, all right, thank you. So when you go to droughtatlas.unl.edu, you'll be presented with this view here. So there are two main tabs that you would want to be interested in. First, let's start with our map viewer. So we're just going to view all the different climate stations we have in this. So right now we have a bit over 4,500, looks like 4,617 stations across the United States. Many of these are in the National Weather Service's Cooperative Observing Network. Most of these stations are still active. We do have some legacy stations in here that did quit collecting data sometime in the last 10 or so years. But again, most of these are active stations. So many of these collect temperature data. All of the ones that you see on the screen collect daily precipitation data. We've done some statistical analysis to any missing data that's in these long-term data sets. We've done some statistics to do some estimated data filling with that. But these are pretty full long-term data sets going back anywhere from the last 30, 40 years to, in the cases of a few of these stations, over a century long. So it's a pretty valuable tool for just looking at long-term data. And so what we've done is taken this daily temperature and precip data and calculated drought indices from that. So just quick overview here. I'll pull up a few things. So reference some of these climate clusters here. So this kind of gives you an idea, and I'll focus specifically on the West, but we've denoted with these red lines these different clusters that have stations that, based on different micro and macro climates, tend to behave similarly in terms of their precipitation and temperature patterns. So you can group the stations as is if you want here. One way that this can be useful is, let's say you have if you want to know something about the climate, say here in kind of south central Idaho around, for instance, Craters in the Moon area. All of these stations in this area have been grouped in the same climate cluster. So you can use some of these different stations relatively confidently as a proxy for what your long-term climatology may look like in areas where you don't have data. So I'll go ahead and just pull up that. So for instance, you can just click on one of these green dots here and you can see what the period of record is for the station, what the location is, what the name of the station is. It's a 6-digit identification number. So let's go ahead and pull up some of the long-term data from these stations. So to do this, I'm going to go ahead and mouse over the data tab and click on the climate tab here. So in this way, you can search by state here. So I'm going to go ahead and pick Wyoming here for fun. Let's go ahead and go, I believe that might be one of the Jackson Hole area stations. Yeah, so it's station 484910 that highlighted Jackson here. So I'm going to do update selection. So we can see for this station now has a time period record that goes from 1937 through 2022. Most of these stations will see updates, and then probably in the next few months, we're working on those updates right now to get data updated through 2023. We'll be doing the same thing with the hydrology data, which we'll show you guys momentarily. So up on the top list of tabs here, these are some examples of data that you can look at for each of these different stations. So for instance, if I want to know what basically historical droughts in the Jackson, Wyoming area look like going back to 1937, I can use some of the commonly used drought indices to monitor drought in that area. So let's say we want to look at SPI at a 6-month time frame, so we can check 6 months here, maybe do one data point for every month. Let's just look at the whole period of record. So I'll go ahead and show you guys mouse over this. If I just click this SPI time series chart here, we can now see, and mouse over, you can see the individual monthly values, what different dry and wet periods for a 6-month aggregation period SPI look like for Jackson. If I want to export a graph, I can click the export graph button. It'll download a ping. I don't know why that pulled up a picture of a thunderstorm there, but you can see that data here. You can also take a screenshot of this so you can see, let's say we have multiple timeframes of SPI pulled up. I can take a screenshot so I can see the legend for that as well. So another neat thing that we've done with this, and you can also look at an SPEI, which takes into account temperature and the basically the balance between incoming precipitation and then evapotranspiration estimates. That's precipitation minus ET estimate. And they just run an SPI on that. But one other thing we've done with this then is look at some of the long-term trends in some of these indices. So just for simplicity, I'm going to look at SPI here. So let's just look at the basically values for the whole calendar year. So this is a 12-month SPI subsampled to December. I'm going to go ahead and click this. So what we can actually see here is that since 1950, if we run a long-term trend on this, we've tended towards wetter conditions at this station according to this monthly SPI or our 12-month SPI. Obviously, there's year-to-year variability, decade-to-decade variability within that. If we look at a shorter time period, so a couple quick things about this graph that I did skirt over. You can see the numerical change in whatever data set we're looking at per decade here. So in this case, SPI is tending to change by about 0.177 units per decade in the positive. So this blue dashed line that you see up here means that we have an increasing or wetting trend in that particular data set over the time period that we're interested in. So that is statistically significant at a 95% confidence interval. If we change the confidence interval to something lower, in this case, we are still looking at a statistically significant trend. But if we maybe change the time period we're looking at to 1985 now at this time period, over a shorter amount of time, we're not looking at a statistically significant trend anymore for a shorter time period like this. So again, you can kind of break the data down in different ways, look for statistical significance in whatever confidence interval you want, and just look at raw changes in your data sets that you're interested. So we can also break this down by season. So if we want to just look at SPI during winter, let's change the statistical significance. So you see it is statistically significant wetting trend if you look at an 85% confidence interval, but not if you ratchet that confidence interval up to 97.5. So again, we can break this down by different seasons if we want to, or we can look at something like, at least in the plains or growing season, April through September. You can look at it. Yeah, again, just a lot of different ways to break this data down. So there's not enough time for this presentation to really show you what all of these look like. A couple other things I do want to look at here. We've tried to look at the number of days with precipitation falling at all, or changes in the number of more significant precipitation days, such as days that receive at least half an inch of precipitation or an inch of precipitation. Especially in parts of the kind of central and northeastern US, we have seen some significant increases in the number of days with heavier precipitation amounts with long-term climate change. And you can look at these types of data for really any of the stations. Of course, when you're looking at some of the heavier daily precipitation amounts out west, we do have a significant number of days in the period of record that just for number of days that don't have at least an inch of precipitation. So you have to kind of know what you're looking for when you're breaking the data down too. But for the sake of time, I'm going to run over to our hydrology tab here. So let's go ahead and pull up our hydrology station map viewer. So all of these stations here are stream flow monitoring sites from the US Geological Survey's Gauges 2 network, formerly called the Hydroclimatic Data Network 2009. Basically, this is a data set that hydrologists at USGS identified as having both long-term, relatively full daily stream flow data sets and are sites that have minimal interference from human activity, such as maybe dams or other water management types of things. So these sites that you see on here, according to USGS scientists, should have some of the most correlated to what your weather and climate conditions are stream flow sites. So you can look at things such as a standardized stream flow index on this. So I'm going to go ahead and go over to our individual sites here. Go ahead and pick a different state. Let's maybe do Colorado this time. I'll go ahead and pull this one up here, say update selection. So for this, we've calculated a standardized stream flow index. This is just like the SPI for the, and I'm sorry, for anyone unfamiliar with SPI or SSI in here, basically what you're doing is you're trying to communicate something about a summation, or in the case of stream flow, we've computed this as an average of a value over a certain period of time compared to that same period of time during that time of year over the course of the historical record at that station, or sometimes this is computed with respect to whatever the climate normals are. So in this case, that's not how we do it for these data sets, but you can see sometimes drought indices that are like with respect to like the 1991 to 2020 period. And so what that numerically is basically doing is it's modeling that histogram with some sort of statistical distribution. For an SPI, it uses a gamma distribution. For an SSI, we did both a gamma distribution and Tweedy family of distributions, which has been shown by previous research to do a better job modeling stream flow, especially in sites that have a lot of days with zero stream flow. And what you get out of that is something like its z-score, standard deviation. So positive numbers above normal or significantly above normal, negative numbers significantly below normal. Anyway, so with all that, we'll go ahead and look at, let's say, a 1 month standardized stream flow index for the station, so you can see what that looks like. I can plot the data here, and we need to pick a probability type and plot the data again. So right now, the station only goes through the end of 2018. I'll be updating this pretty soon to go through 2023 for stations for which that's available. But again, we can see kind of the long-term monthly stream flow index patterns where we can pick out our drier and wetter patterns, and we can then compare these graphs to see what nearby, say, SPI measuring stations look like. So if you're interested in the kind of hydroclimatic history at any of these stations, you can query just a standardized stream flow index from here. We do also have trends that you can look at for these data sets as well. So there are more things that you can pull up on the Drought Risk Atlas. I'd be happy to take any questions at the end here or over email, but for the sake of time, I'll go ahead and call at the end of my presentation. Finally, if you want to see my email address here, it is criganti2@unl.edu. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Curtis. The Drought Risk Atlas tool is really awesome, and I hope folks learned a little bit more about how to use it. Such a valuable resource. I am looking in I put a little note in the chat for folks, if you have questions, to please put them in the chat versus the question box, because for some reason the question box is not showing up for me right now. And I want to be able to see your questions. And I'll give it a minute or two for folks to chime in. And while we are waiting for any questions that anyone may have, look out for the registration and announcement for the June Intermountain West Drought Conditions webinar. And always feel free to reach out with any questions to me, questions or connections, happy to help. I see one, and that is, Curtis, could you, well, actually either one of you could take this one. Could you explain the definition of a gridded data set?
Of a gridded data set?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious to know in what context that's being asked, but just generally, so you can have, and John, please feel free to chime in on this. When you're mapping data, you can have generally two types of data. You look at either grids or raster, or either rasters or point type of data. Oh, and I explained this very well. Imagine you have a bunch of weather stations situated across a region. So those weather stations are collecting observations at specific points. Now, so that would be an example of just like a point data set. So you can just identify each specific location that data is collecting at, and you don't, strictly speaking, know what's going on between those points. A gridded data set would be, maybe you have what's I call a raster of data. Imagine like weather radar data, for instance. You have a more continuous set of, you can think of kind of like grid boxes next to almost like a chessboard, where you know about what the value is in each of those squares or physical spaces all next to each other. So you have a more continuous spatial data set. So radar data would be an example of a gridded data set. You can also take point data and interpolate it to a grid, basically estimate the values of, if you wanted to have a gridded data set based on what the point data are around a grid cell, what the value for that grid cell should be. But that's completely dependent on what statistical method you use to fill those cells. So, John, did you have anything to add to that?
Not sure if John's having a hard time unmuting or just doesn't have anything to add, but I would say that was a great explanation, Curtis.
Okay.
And I don't see any other questions coming in. Here is my email. Always feel free to reach out. And I see one more. I don't know if it's a question or the Drought Atlas looks awesome and I'm excited to explore it. Is it possible to download the standardized stream index data?
Short answer, I think yes. I can try to see how the best way to do that in a moment here. So if you do a table, yes, so I can actually share my screen again if you want. I can show people how to do that.
I will make you the presenter.
All right, so if we want to see the actual values themselves, so right now we've got the SSI points plotted up on here on this graph. That's when we have this little plot the time series chart button. If you click the one next to it on your mouse over, it says SSI time series table. So I'll go ahead and click that. So this is just showing the first 10 rows. I'm gonna say just do all. So then there's a download button. So if you click that, that should have downloaded. No, hold on. That should have downloaded a file. And I don't actually see it. So I'm gonna talk to our web person about that because that didn't actually seem to work properly. If there's a specific station or set of stations you're interested in, please feel free to let me know, because I've got access to that data locally on my end too, but I will look into why that's not working, because I think you're able to download those. So
Awesome.
sorry about the confusion there.
No worries. I did put your email in the chat in case
Okay,
I
very
didn't
good.
catch it fast enough. And we will be posting a summary of and recording of this webinar if you would like to share with other colleagues that weren't able to attend today and or would like to revisit some of the information that we presented. And, oh, let's see, I'm gonna look one more time. Yep, doesn't look like we have any other questions, but thank you everyone for coming. We really appreciate your attendance and we will see you next month.